Let's see how we can get the user's permission. So in app.js, I'm simply returning the screen component that we built in the first part of this course. For now, we want to take a break from our app and study the image picker in isolation. So when our component gets rendered, we want to get the user's permission. In class components, we have the component didMount method. But in function components, we don't have this method. Here we have to use the effect hook. At this point, you need to be familiar with this concept. So I'm going to call the effect hook, give it a function. Now, as you know, this function that we pass here gets executed every time our component gets rendered. Now, in this case, we don't want to keep asking the user's permission. We want to do this only the first time our component gets rendered. How do we do this? Well, this useEffect function has an optional second parameter, which is an array of dependencies. We can pass a bunch of variables here. Now, anytime any of these variables changes, this function will get re-executed. Now, what if we pass an empty array? That means this function will get executed only once because it's not dependent to any variables. We have no dependency here. So the code that we write here will be equivalent to the code in component didMount. Okay? Now we want to get the user's permission. So on the top, we import everything as image picker from expo-image picker. Now, this image picker object has a bunch of useful properties and methods. Look, all of these are perfectly documented. In this lesson, we're going to use the request method. We can request camera permission or camera roll permission, which is the library. So let's call this method. As you can see from the name, this is an async method. So we need to await it to get the result. So when the promise is resolved, we're going to get this result object. Now, because we have used await here, we have to mark this function as async. But now we have a problem. If we run our app, we're going to get a warning because we cannot pass an async function to the effect hook. Here's the reason. When we mark this function as async, implicitly it returns a promise. So even though we don't have an explicit return statement here, implicitly a promise will be returned. Now the useEffect function cannot accept a function that returns a promise. Here we can only return a function. This function will be used for cleaning up. So when our component is going to get unmounted, this function is going to get executed. That is the reason why we cannot return a promise here. So to solve this problem, I'm going to move this logic inside a separate function. So let's define a function. We can call that request permission. This is an async function. Now we're going to move this logic over here. Okay. Now back to the useEffect function. We're going to remove the async, and here we just call request permission. Note that I'm not awaiting this call, because if you await this, we have to mark this as async, and it doesn't work. So here we're simply calling an async function and moving on. We are not waiting for the result of this function, okay? Now, back to our request permission function. Now, this result object has a bunch of properties like can ask again, expires, granted, and status. Granted is a Boolean property. So if it's false, we're going to display an alert and say, you need to enable permission to access the library. Now here we can improve this code and use object destructuring. Because we only need the granted property, we can destructure this object and pick this property and then use it over here. That's simpler. Now let's test our app. So save the changes. Okay, we get this dialog box. Expo would like access to your photos. Now in the future, when we build a standalone app, Expo will be replaced with the name of our app, okay? Now, whatever we set here will be remembered by the device, so the next time we run our app, we're not going to get this dialog box. And that means when we call the request method, we're going to get the answer immediately, okay? Now let's set this to don't allow. We get this alert, you need to enable permissions, okay? Let's reload the app. Look, this time we didn't get that dialog box, we got the answer immediately. So we're telling the user they have to enable permissions to use this feature. Now, on iPhone, we can go to the settings, and over here we have Expo. Look at the permissions for photos. It's set to never. Let's change this to read and write. Now, Back to our app. We get this dialog box, experience needs permissions. The messaging is changed. I'm not entirely sure why, but this is not something you need to worry about. So let's allow permissions. Now, if we reload our app, we don't see an alert anymore. So this is how we can get the user's permission. Now, there's another way to do this using the Permissions API. We'll talk about that next.